Alright guys, welcome back, and let's go with video number 3 for Unit 5. And we're talking about biogeochemical cycling, and now we're going to talk about the first cycle that's really heavily reliant on bacteria, and that's the nitrogen cycle. So where can we find nitrogen? Well, nitrogen is one of the most abundant elements on the planet. It's found all throughout our atmosphere in the form of nitrogen gas. It's super important in the biosphere because it makes up, a prime molecule element that we find in lots of very important biological molecules like proteins and DNA. And we'll also find it in the geosphere, in our soils, in the form of nitrates, which are really, really important for plant growth. So nitrogen is a super, super important element, and bacteria have a huge role to play in how it cycles. Now, nitrogen will move mostly from our atmosphere, which is the layer of gases that surround the Earth, through organisms which need those molecules, or those elements of nitrogen in those important molecules, in order to carry out normal metabolism and have a healthy living, and then they convert it back to the atmosphere. So if we look down at this picture here, the nitrogen cycle, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the next. We're going to see a lot of this figure, in the next few slides. You'll look at what organisms are really, really active here, what ones are really, really important, and you'll see here time after time after time, we're going to see bacteria playing a huge role in almost all of the steps of this cycle. So this cycle is probably the most heavily relied upon in terms of bacterial microbial activity. So it can be pretty daunting when you first look at it, but if we go through it step by step, we'll be able to figure it out together. Now, where do we find the most nitrogen? Well, quite simple. Everyone take a deep breath. Alright? If you held in a deep breath, what you realize now is that 78% of what you just breathed in is nitrogen. Okay? And I'm sad to say, if you didn't know this, we can't use that in gas form. So if you take in a breath of air, 78% is going to be nitrogen, and that 78% of nitrogen is going to be breathed out unchanged when you exhale. And I hope everyone exhaled. So that deep breath that you took, we're only interested in that part right there, the 20.9% that's oxygen. And that's what our body's going to use in our metabolism to convert sugars to energy so that we can do what we need to do in the run of a day. But the nitrogen needs to be used. We need to find a way to get it into biological systems. And the way that we do that is through the activity of bacteria, mostly. So we're going to look down here in this figure with the rabbit, and you're going to see we have nitrogen fixation, we've got ammonification, assimilation, denitrification, nitrification. These are all reactions that are controlled by microorganisms through the metabolism, and they're important steps on how nitrogen goes from the abiotic world into the biotic world, and how we can use nitrogen once it gets in there. If you were to check your D2L shell, you'll notice that I added a nitrogen cycle cheat sheet. So if you want to print that out as you're going through these notes, I think that'll help you. What I've done is I've shown the areas that are the different species of nitrogen, which I've got on this slide here. So when we're talking about chemical species, we're talking about how this element will present itself. So we're talking about, in this case, we've got nitrogen gas, which is in our atmosphere. We've got nitrate, NO3 negative. That's going to be the one that's most useful for plants. We've got nitrite, also available for plants, not as good. Ammonia, which is toxic, which doesn't do our environment very much good at all. Ammonium, which is okay. And then nitrous oxide, which is kind of an intermediary step, or kind of a byproduct in our respect, from our point of view. So on our cheat sheet, I've got all of these listed and spelled out at the top of the page so that you'll be able to keep these different species of nitrogen in mind as we're going through the different reactions. Now, on the bottom of that cheat sheet, I've also included a summary of what each one of these 4 different reactions that you guys are going to need to know to understand the nitrogen cycle. So I've kind of explained them as well. So as we're going through the cycle, if you've got the cheat sheet next to you, you'll be able to get a perspective of what nitrogen species I'm talking about, how the bacteria is manipulating that species of nitrogen, and what reaction is going on and where. So I think that having the cheat sheet next to you is always a good idea to try and keep these reactions straight and fresh in your mind. Alright, so let's get into the first important reaction that bacteria have in a nitrogen cycle. And bacteria are unique on the planet in that they have the ability to fix nitrogen. Now, like I mentioned to you earlier, when you breathe that nitrogen in, we can't do anything with it. All we do is breathe it back out. So it's wasted on us, essentially. But bacteria can take in atmospheric nitrogen, N2, and they have the enzymatic machinery to convert that into ammonium, NH4+. So they take in N2 and they turn that into NH4+. So that NH4+, which is ammonium, now that can be used in plants and other bacterial species and fungi, for example, and they can incorporate that into their tissues. So this is a really, really important step. Not only that, but ammonium is a good jumping off place, and we can turn it into different things further down the chain. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But what's really, really important is bacteria have this enzyme called nitrogenase, and they're the only organisms on Earth to have it. And what nitrogenase does is it allows those bacteria to take that N2 and turn it into something useful, which is what we call fixing. Can you think of an example of other fixing that we just talked about? Think back to carbon. We take carbon dioxide, which again, if we breathe it in, we just breathe it out. But plants have the ability to fix carbon. So they can take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and fix it, turn it into something useful, which is sugar, which we can then use incorporate into plant tissue. So it's kind of analogous to plants fixing carbon, except this is unique. Only bacteria can do that. And some examples of these bacteria that can do that are the cyanobacteria and the azobacter. So they're pretty special organisms. The only other way that nitrogen can get fixed, by the way, is atmospheric fixing, which is done by lightning. So you can imagine the type of energy that's required, but bacteria can do it just by using enzymes. The next group of bacteria we'll have are the nitrifying bacteria. Now, nitrifying bacteria are quite important because they'll take the ammonia or the ammonium that's created by our nitrogen fixing bacteria, or there's some processes in the soil that'll do stuff called ammonification we'll talk about in a bit. But they can take these 2 species of nitrogen and then turn it into nitrates, NO3 negative. Now, NO3 negative is the most useful form of nitrogen for plants, and it's part of the fertilizer. If you go to buy fertilizer for your plants, there will be a ratio for N, P, and K. Well, the N portion is going to be mostly nitrates. So that's the most effective use of nitrogen for plants. So once these nitrifying bacteria convert ammonia and ammonium into nitrates, now plants can use them in their roots, and they can grow bigger and faster, produce more fruit, produce more leaves, so on and so forth. So these are a very beneficial bacteria for plants in this nitrogen cycle. Now, the other side of that coin is we get our denitrifying bacteria, and they do basically the other side to this reaction. They take the nitrates, which are very, very useful for plants, and through a series of reactions, they turn them into nitrites, nitrous oxide, and then eventually nitrogen gas. Now, that nitrogen gas will escape back into the atmosphere, and now it's not usable for plants anymore. So in terms of plant growth, we consider denitrifying bacteria kind of wasteful because it takes nitrates from the soil and then returns it back into the atmosphere. Now, of course, from their point of view, this is a very helpful reaction because they're getting energy from it. But in terms of growing plants, if you're a farmer with crops, then denitrifying bacteria are kind of working against you. Okay, so let's have a look at decomposition now, which is another major reaction that bacteria control in the nitrogen cycle. Now, when bacteria are breaking down dead organic matter, that comes from plants or animals, they release nitrogen in a couple of different ways. One way is through the ammonium ion, which is fine. Ammonium can be used for plants, but it can also release it in the form of NH3, which is ammonia. Now, ammonia is not good. It can be toxic in the environment. So what happens in the soil is that we have a process called ammonification, and what we do in ammonification is we add hydrogen ions to our molecules of NH3, and we end up with NH4+, which is the ammonium ion. So this process is called ammonification, and it's super important because it takes care of this NH3, which is toxic. If that NH3 is allowed to build up, then we can have troubles in the environment. All right. Sorry. So getting back to our nitrogen cycle. If you guys are at a point now where you can fill in the blanks on this sheet, then you've got a really good grasp on it, okay? You should be quite happy. And you can move on to the next cycle. So this is a kind of a quiz for you guys to try and do. Fill this out so that you get a good understanding of the nitrogen cycle. Now, if you can't do that, then of course I've got the the answers here. So you can go back and forth, and you can help yourself hopefully understand the cycle a bit better. But let's go through it quickly together. Now, we start off with our nitrogen in the atmosphere, right? That's our 78% that we can't use. So let's look at this. Let's start over here with our decomposition. So we get our decomposers, and our decomposers will release ammonia, or nitrogen, sorry, in two different species. We'll get it released as NH4, which is good, but we'll also get it released as NH3, which is ammonia, and that's not so good. Our nitrogen fixing bacteria, these are the ones that are going to be living, and they can take the N2 directly from the atmosphere and turn it into nitrogen that plants can use. So we'll have these guys working together, and these bacteria will all be contributing nitrogen into the soil. The NH3 that's being produced, that's dangerous. That'll be converted through ammonification, and then that'll be converted into the ammonium ion. So at this point now, we've got all the decomposers, and we've got the nitrogen fixed from the atmosphere, and we've get it into to basically the ammonium ion. Now from there, we're going to have our nitrifying bacteria, and remember, these are the good guys. They're going to take this ammonium, and they're going to take also the process from ammonification, and they're going to turn that into nitrates, and then they're going to get turned into nitrites, and then they get turned into nitrates. Now, here's kind of the split or the fork in the road. Remember, the nitrates are the best form of nitrogen for plants. So at this point now, those plants are going to take up as much of that nitrogen as they can. They're going to use it in their proteins, they're going to use it in their DNA, and they're going to use it as best they can to grow and thrive and reproduce. Now, while this is happening, of course, we're going to have our denitrifying bacteria. And these denitrifying bacteria, if they get a hold of these nitrates, well then they're going to take them, and through a bunch of reactions, they're going to turn them back into N2, which goes back into the atmosphere. And it's lost until we go through this nitrogen fixation again. So the nitrogen fixation can happen either through bacteria or through a bolt of lightning.